Hello, my name is Edward Shi, and today I will be discussing the differences between disaster films from three different time periods through American history. These three films that I will be analyzing are Earthquake from 1974, Dante's Peak from 1995, and San Andreas from 2015. In Earthquake, a series of earthquakes strikes Southern California and forces a multitude of different characters, which the leading one is played by Charlton Heston, to join together and find ways to survive. In Dante's Peak, a volcanologist played by Pierce Brosnan has to race against time to convince his superior and a city mayor to prepare for a volcanic eruption from a town called Dante's Peak. In San Andreas, a firefighter played by Dwayne Johnson has to find his family amidst a devastating massive series of earthquakes in Southern California. One aspect of disaster films is that they are influenced by the political landscapes at the time in which they are made. In the 1970s, the Cold War was taking place, and there was a focus on rallying Americans against foreign threats, while there was also the Civil Rights Movement with its liberal effects on changing and improving society. This led to what Kakodakis states as, quote, narratives of political choice, ethical obligation, and public and private responsibility. As a result, Earthquake, which came out in 1974, extensively depicted citizens from all walks of American society banding together to rescue each other regardless of racial, marital, or economic differences. The characters include an actor, a policeman, and an African American biker. In the 1990s, the communist countries collapsed, ending the Cold War that encouraged confrontation between the world powers, and so this had the effect of encouraging cooperation between different countries and peoples to confront environmental challenges such as climate change. Thus, Dante's Peak, which came out in 1995, focuses on the need for authority figures from across different levels and sectors of society to cooperate effectively for the safety and welfare of the American people. The main characters are government volcanologists and a city mayor. The 2010s are a continuation of that post-Cold War political landscape, with a multipolar world and advances in social media encouraging cooperation between different cultures and peoples to resolve more global issues. However, the recession of 2008 and the expanding powers of the US government also led to public concerns about what Kakodakis states as, quote, institutional structures that are secretive, proprietary, supremacist, and uncaring. And so, in San Andreas, which came out in 2015, there are two father figures in the plot, with the more modest working man with a physically intensive job being portrayed as much more heroic than a wealthy businessman who stops being friendly and amicable during a disaster and is willing to abandon his own loved one to save his own skin. Another aspect of disaster films is what Roos calls a tendency for martyr characters. Roos defines these martyrs as persons who have been bad parents, criminals, alcoholics, or just foolish, who then compensate for their early shortcomings by sacrificing their lives for the younger generation. And so, in Earthquake, Charlton Heston's character, Stuart, is what Roos calls a social misfit martyr character, because he is an imperfect husband in a failing marriage with his wife and cheats on her with a much younger woman named Denise. Stuart is actually a subversion of Roos's martyr because although he leads a rescue mission that saves Denise, her sons, and dozens of other civilians in the climax, he sacrifices himself to save a person the same age as him instead of someone younger, his wife, fails, and dies while trying. In Dante's Peak, Grandma Ruth neatly fits Roos's definition of a martyr character because her refusal to evacuate from the mountain threatens the lives of her grandchildren, who then have to go rescue her after the eruption. When the boat her family is fleeing in is about to be trapped in a boiling lake, Ruth redeems her earlier mistakes by jumping into the boiling water and pushing the boat to safety, sacrificing herself but saving her family. Ruth is thus what Roos calls a bad parent kind of disaster movie martyr. Uniquely, in San Andreas, there actually aren't any characters that neatly fit Roos's definition of a martyr character. One character named Kim sacrifices himself to save a child while the Hoover Dam collapses, but he actually has no character flaws, and he dies less than 15 minutes into the movie, before even the main disaster strikes. Meanwhile, Daniel, Emma's boyfriend and Blake's new stepfather in the movie, is a bad parent because he abandons Blake in a trapped car during the earthquake. However, Daniel is then killed without making any meaningful sacrifices to try and help other people, and thus he's not a martyr. It's worth mentioning that these films are proof that martyrs in disaster films are predominantly white, which falls under the second pattern of misrepresentation, or the underrepresentation of people of color. A third aspect of disaster films is how they often have the trade-off between investing in a better story or better special effects. Earthquake used exclusively practical effects. They also extensively used miniature models to simulate buildings and structures being destroyed, and due to the lack of CGI, computer-generated images because computers were not available yet, my engagement with Earthquake actually increased because the practical effects made the film appear much more realistic. Like Earthquake, Dante's Peak made extensive use of miniature models and practical effects during the disaster scenes, with the very realistic pyroclastic flows actually being plumes of powder shot out of air cannons. And so the invention of CGI in the 90s meant that Dante's Peak was actually one of the first disaster films to use CGI, along with Titanic. But CGI back then was so expensive and tedious that it was only used in a few scenes depicting lava. Since the vast majority of special effects were practical instead of CGI, I was not able to easily tell which scenes used CGI, which increased my engagement with the film since all of the effects appeared so realistic. Unlike the other two films, San Andreas in 2015 uses CGI so extensively that many of the disaster scenes would be unrecognizable without the aid of computer graphics. And although there are several scenes, usually ones that involve water and flooding, where actual sets and practical effects are used, the computer-generated scenes are far more common. And so, I felt that the heavy reliance on CGI decreased a lot of my engagement with San Andreas because the disaster scenes are just so lavish and over the top with destruction and mayhem that it was difficult for me to take up the threat of the earthquake seriously when it's very obvious that the destruction is meant to be a spectacle for audiences to be entertained with, instead of being portrayed as a force of nature that the characters and the audience should dread and be afraid of, because they're realistic. And thus, I agree with one writer's conclusion that although CGI effects can help a movie by creating impressive spectacles, they say that CGI cannot replace a good story or substitute an intelligent script with meaningful dialogue. And of the three films, I found the one film that made extensive use of CGI to have the weakest plot and characters, while the two that used mostly practical effects had the stronger ones. If I were to modify the plot of an existing film that was made before 2000 to reflect the current political landscape of 2020, I believe that the 2020s will see a return to the 1960s political landscape where media will emphasize personal responsibility and ethics during disasters. I believe that this will be because there will be a widespread public perception that many of the problems faced by current American society in 2020 are caused by a lack of good personal responsibility and moral character in the US government under the Trump administration, such as the mishandling of the coronavirus, rollbacks of environmental regulations, and worsening race relations that the government has refused to address. And so many Americans are frustrated with the government that even former President Carter stated that we need a government as good as its people, and we are better than this. And so with this political landscape in mind, I would modify the plot of Earthquake so that Jody, the villainous bisexual soldier, is altered to be a much more heroic character, and so he does not needlessly murder his roommates and attempt to rape one of the female characters. By making Jody heroic instead of villainous, he would become a fully positive representation of an LGBT person instead of the problematic one that he originally already is, addressing pattern 7, the misrepresentation of sexuality. And so, if I were to decide who would become the martyr of my remade version of Earthquake, I would choose Jody to be another martyr character besides Stewart by using his army truck to carry civilians in the suburbs to high ground when the dam breaks, as in the original movie. When the flood overtakes his truck now filled with civilians, which should be depicted as being mostly women and children, Jody crashes it against a tall building and throws civilians onto the roof before being swept away by the current to his death. The social commentary would be that one's personal differences, like their sexuality, shouldn't factor into one's ability to be an upstanding and heroic person. And so, I personally believe that a remake of Earthquake should adhere to the original's reliances on practical effects so that audiences will accept the event on screen as more realistic and to be taken seriously. And so my flood scene with Jody would use practical effects with miniatures as seen in the original and in the flood scenes during a tsunami movie like in The Impossible. Unlike San Andreas, I would value a better written story above elaborate special effects, with more emphasis on developing characters than showing scenes of lavish destruction. The message that I would want to send audiences is that although natural disasters may be inevitable and impossible to predict, that's no excuse for people to stop trying to be the best they can be in the name of survival. In conclusion, I have discussed how the political landscape of an era will affect the storylines of disaster films made in it, how martyr characters are a key part of disaster films, the give or take relationship between special effects and storylines in disaster films, and how I would make changes to one of the disaster films that I watched. Thank you for watching.